G'day humans. Well, I'm about as far away as you can get from the hullabaloo of the inauguration, both metaphorically and literally. For those of you watching the YouTube, you will see that I am standing in front of a South Pacific volcano and the lapping shores of the South Pacific on an overwater bungalow on an island that you can only get to by taking a boat from another island that you can only get to by taking a Dash 8 from another island that you can only get to by taking a Dash 8 from one of the smallest and most dysfunctional but beautiful developing world capital cities in the South Pacific. I'm in the Solomon Islands, which is a fly-speck archipelago of tropical paradise wedged somewhere between Australia and Hawaii is probably as best one needs to place it, around Palau, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Vanuatu. And I cannot explain, talk about like first world insights here, I cannot explain how good it is to not be consuming 24-hour news at the moment. That being said, this is a terrific cracker of an episode. The last episode, I basically wanted to tee up inauguration with a conversation with two Republicans. One, a pro-Trump Republican, that was the last episode that you heard with Batya Ungar-Sargon, and one with a never-Trump Republican, today's guest, David Frum. David's one of my favorite conservative thinkers in America. He probably needs no introduction, but I'll just give you a potted reminder. He was a speechwriter in the White House for George W. Bush. He was considered instrumental in the sort of lead up to the Iraq War. He coined the most famous phrase of George W. Bush's presidency, the axis of evil, which was given at his State of the Union after the September 11th terrorist attacks and before the invasion of Iraq. And over the course of the subsequent couple of decades has become a more and more principled voice against the derangement of the Republican Party and was one of the earliest and most prominent anti-Trump Republicans. He has since, most recently, left the Republican Party altogether in disgust. He doesn't know quite what he is now, I suppose. He professionally is a journalist more than anything. He's a senior editor at The Atlantic, and you can see him frequently on MSNBC. But he's a deep thinker about strategy, about politics, about the deepest kind of politics, really, the sort of old school vision of politics as a polity, a strategy, not a knee-jerk reaction to populist whims. So I loved this conversation that I recorded just before I hopped on a plane and went to the middle of nowhere. There will be more great programming coming up, but please just enjoy this inauguration day amid all of the insanity, this breath of fresh air from the one, the only, David Frum. How are you feeling, David, ahead of a second Trump term?
Well, of course I have foreboding. I feel an intense sense of shame. It's different from 2016-17 because back then one could look at the first Trump presidency as basically a kind of technical glitch in American democracy. Trump had lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, and not by, if the election had been the other way, if Hillary Clinton had come out on top in the Electoral College, it wasn't especially close. I mean, he got a smaller share of the vote than Mitt Romney did, than John Kerry did, than Al Gore did. But the Electoral College worked in his favor. There had been this Russian interference, and you could say something went wrong and we face a tremendous challenge, but you don't have to have any question marks about the basic character of the country. This time, it's a tougher thing. Trump did win outright. He brought with him very tiny but real majorities in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. All of the elected power of the United States government is in the hands of Trump and his party. They will be able to use that power. And so I feel foreboding. I think no one promises that democracies never make mistakes. It's a serious mistake. But I also feel a sense of commitment. We have to pull ourselves together and meet this challenge. There have been other dark times in American history. Here's one more.
One thing you just said that you feel is shame, David. Why shame?
I was born in Canada, grew up in Canada, still spend a lot of time there. And you may feel, this may resonate with you as an Australian. There is a sense of belief in America that those of us who grew up under American protection often have even more intensely than any American does. Because we understand very vividly what our worlds would look like if America weren't there, what it would mean for Australia to be alone in that big Pacific without America, what it would mean for Canada to be this mid-sized country alone in the world without America. And so we have this extra dimension of belief and faith and confidence. And if we are on the right or center right, we spend a lot of time arguing with our left-wing co-nationals who are very anti-American about the decency and goodness of the American nation, its trustworthiness. And so there's the sense shame is a sense of being let down, that all those arguments I've had for now many decades with people who said a different view of America, they've got a big talking point in their favor beginning this Inauguration Day.
Shame for having argued for something that you now regard as having been what?
No, I don't. No, shame. I don't regard that, but shame because it's like some of your friends are maligning another friend, and you stand up for the friend and you champion them, and you maybe are outnumbered, and then the friend knocks open the door, says something obscene, and falls down face forward drunk, and you think, okay, I look stupid.
Right. Yep. And you also just said an interesting thing that pricked my ears, which is about the character of America. Yeah. There are many reasons to feel a sense of foreboding this Inauguration Day, to do with international relations, to do with the democratic institutions and kind of autocracy in America or cronyism in America, to do with the possible punishing of Trump's enemies. They're all kind of practical things, but I don't normally frame my dread as a question about America's character. Why choose that frame?
Look, Trump speaks to a series of ideas, some of them plausible, some of them not, some of them even a little bit true. But the secret of his power, the secret of his appeal, is that he appeals to something bad in people. He's an obviously appalling human being. And you expect normal people to react to that with revulsion. But some people react to it with excitement. It's liberating for them. And I know, people who are not unintelligent and not unpatriotic, and who resonate to Trump. And you think, how could they do it? And because I think in some sense that he has liberated some dark energy in them, and they find it exciting. And that's what I mean about this appealing to the character. The secret of Trump is that he is. People often sometimes ask me, is there anything good to say about Donald Trump? And I say, well, there are some good things. And one of them is he's not a hypocrite. He doesn't pretend to be a good person. He is a nakedly bullying, cruel, dominating, deceitful, vicious person. Makes no bones about it. During the wildfires in California, that he was gloating about it and mocking the people who were dispossessed of their homes and attacking the political leadership and just saying one hurtful thing after another in the middle of this extremity. And we have to face, look, the Roman Colosseum stood for something like 500 years, putting bums in seats twice a week to watch people hack each other into little pieces. And as I understand it, it was a going business concern the whole time, that there's something in human beings we will pay to watch people hack each other into little pieces. And that thing that was there in the Colosseum, that's the thing that Trump speaks to. And this time around, last time you could say, well, more people voted against it than voted for it. This time you have to admit more Americans voted for it than voted against it.
On his lack of hypocrisy, I remember, David, in 2016 trying to explain to Australian friends and colleagues that his election victory, and one of the things in my toolkit would be to say part of his shtick and his appeal is to say Hillary Clinton and the rest of those lobbyists on K Street and the elites in Washington, they will betray you behind closed doors. They will go to Davos on their fancy private jets and they will sell you up the river. They will lie to you and pretend that they're not. I will lie to you straight from the podium.
Yeah. And I will take advantage of you, and I will cheat you, and I will, I will sell you these stupid coins that are worthless. My wife will market a $90 Christmas ornament made in China that is worth 9 cents. I will go on TV and say of Kamala Harris, she got the questions for her town hall when I know the whole time I got the questions for my town hall.
Just explain that, David, because I didn't know that until I saw your Twitter feed retweet that.
So this has been one of Donald Trump, who was not a very good student and who probably got through some good schools with a lot of parental gifts to the school, but probably a healthy amount of cheating, one would guess, believes that whenever people confront any kind of test, the way they get through it, the way they surmount it is by cheating. He would say that when there were Democratic town halls in 2016, that somebody had given Hillary Clinton the answers, or that somebody had given Kamala Harris the answers. Now, it's absurd, because if you're a working politician who prepares, you go to a town hall, you don't need anyone to tell you what the questions are going to be. There's been one on the economy. There's been one on immigration.
Also, you've presumably just done 543 town halls in similar,
But you've prepared. You've wargamed
towns,
and you've had people come up with oddball questions like, tell me something important that happened to you while you were growing up. You are ready for it. It's not. But Trump insisted again and again that Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris had been given the questions for their town halls. And then it turns out we learn that, and we learn it from a book written by a well-regarded journalist who had been close to the Trump campaign, that when Trump did one of his big Fox News town halls, that a mole inside the network, it wasn't like some disaffected person, had given him the questions, and he wargamed the questions in advance, including that they got him, because he had used this language, but I will be your retribution, that they had trained him to say, I do not intend to exact retribution against my political opponents, which is, again,
who had trained him? The journalists or his
panel of his campaign. Now, normally, again, a normal politician, certainly one running for president, does not need to. By the way, if asked, do you intend to exact extra legal vengeance against your political opponents? The answer is no.
You shouldn't really need to. But David, this is the thing. I mean, if if asked whether or not the men and women of the armed services who went to Iraq, did a good job, you should say yes. You shouldn't say what Trump also said, which is, they threw away their lives on a pointless venture. When asked if John McCain is a hero, you should not say, no, he's not, because I like my heroes not getting shot down. Like, again and again and again and again, he just, we know this now. He blows through the norms, and it doesn't matter.
That goes to the non-hypocrisy. So he hates John McCain because John McCain was hostile to him. He resents John McCain because John McCain was an acknowledged hero, and no one can be admired in Donald Trump's company, especially for something that Donald Trump was incapable of doing. So he had to be attacked and destroyed. So that is a reflex you see again and again. You say something positive, especially something positive that Trump could never possibly do about someone, and Trump will lose control of himself. But here we are, and we are. Trump will be president. He will have a slight majority in the House, a substantial majority in the Senate. He will have a friendly federal court system. He will have a lot of power for at least 2 years. And unlike 2017, when he really didn't know what he wanted to do and didn't know how to do it, this time he enters with a list of things he does want to do, and he does know how to do them.
And he doesn't have the people around him who can tell him not to, or who can constrain him, which is one of the other great fears. I mean, when you just think about the guardrails that existed, when he wanted to use military force against domestic protesters,
one of the guardrails.
Who is the defense secretary now who would stop him from doing that the way that Mark Esper did?
Yeah. One of the things that Trump has learned. Trump is a bully who admires violence. Trump assumed that the U.S. military, the upper reaches, were staffed by people who are also bullies who admired violence. And then, to his dismay, he discovered that actually these are men who had seen violence and want to minimize it to the maximum extent possible. These are men who had seen conflict and understood that allies are huge force multipliers for the United States, and that allies need to have their interests taken into consideration, and that warriors are human beings who hurt and bleed and who need care after the battle and who have families. And by the way, aren't all Southern white men. Many of the warriors are of different groups, and they have to find out ways to work together. And so to Donald Trump's dismay, the people he thought he could most rely on, the uniformed military, the 3 stars and the 4 stars, turned out to be the people they would, of course, carry out any lawful order he gave them, but they would try to restrain them. This time, he's keeping them at bay. And he has schemes of violence. He's picked for the crucial power positions in his administration. Now, we don't know if they'll all get through the Senate, but people of weak character, people of deformed character, people he will have control over. I mean, Pete Hegseth.
I was going to say, an alcoholic co-host of Fox News mornings.
Right.
Weekend mornings.
And someone who, if he is not going to be going on boards, doesn't have friends in the uniformed military, doesn't care what the 3 stars and 4 stars think about him, doesn't care about his place in history. He will just do what Donald Trump says, and will be helpful to Donald Trump in making sure that the next crew of 3 stars and 4 stars are people of less integrity than the present crew of 3 stars and 4 stars. He's chosen, and we'll see if she gets through the Senate, Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence.
Just pause there, David. Just pardon my ignorance about how the military works, but is the appointment of generals, is that a unilateral decision from the Defense Secretary?
No, it's not. It's a very complicated question. So first, generals have to be confirmed by the Senate.
Good.
But there's also an internal screening process that the military sends forth names, recommendations. Now, the Defense Secretary doesn't have to follow them. But especially for the 4 stars, it would be a huge fight if the general did not follow the recommendations. And you'd have to have a very capable person. The way you reshape the military is you start with the colonels and the 1 stars.
Okay.
You don't begin. I mean, you can pick by the time you're getting to people who are CENTCOM commanders, you've got a list of people who have been vetted for their loyalty to the Constitution, for their military competence, for their independence. And people have spent 20, 30, 40 years of their lives in the military and have seen presidents come and go. And 3 stars and 4 stars have worked with at least 2 or 3 presidents quite closely over their career. They're not in awe of them necessarily. And the military studies American history very intensely. And so they all know that you're joining in this life and in the next. Your name is going to be remembered with Dwight Eisenhower and MacArthur, or it's going to be remembered with Benedict Arnold and the Confederate generals. You don't want to be. You want to be with the on the right side of American history, not the wrong. But an abject enough defense secretary who's willing to be guided can reshape the military.
This is sort of a pointer to the broader question about, people's fears about the politicization of the public service. I mean, the vision of this sort of Trumpist vision of an expansive executive, the military is part of the government, and so is the Postal Service, and so is the National Weather Service, and so is the CDC. Yeah. Therefore, I can do what I want with them. And there's this sort of, people might have heard about Project 2025. We did an episode about it. This idea that really there's no reason why you couldn't have political loyalty tests for, a postal worker, or, make a scientist's funding contingent on their political loyalty.
We used to. If you were in American politics in the 19th century, every job, and including like the runners in government office building, every job changed with the elections. And the first question, if you say, I want to be a messenger inside the Department of Agriculture, the question is, well, what did you do to elect President, Rutherford B. Hayes?
Right.
So it was a complete spoil system. Beginning in the 1880s, that has progressively changed. And we've had a more highly skilled civil service chosen not for political loyalty. And while the president is supposed to set broad policy, we don't want the president to say, you know what, there's going to be an election next week in this town. My side looks likely to have some difficulty. So if you could generate a weather forecast predicting rain, that would be really helpful to me. We don't want the president to have that power. And since the 1880s, the Weather Service and many other agencies they're not completely independent, but they have substantial autonomy, and the people have careers. They have career protections.
But that's just a custom, right, David? I mean,
it's in the law.
Technically, constitutionally, aren't they just under the executive branch?
They are in the executive branch, but the exact rules, there have been statutes going back to the 1880s where Congress created life tenure for certain categories of civil service. And that those categories have spread and spread and spread and spread. Now, there are many, the United States has many, many more elected and appointed, politically appointed officials than any other peer democracy.
Yeah.
That
There's much more churn when an election happens and a new team comes in than there would be in Canada or Australia. Or
the Australian equivalent of an assistant secretary of commerce does not change with the election. The American does. We elect state prosecutors, we elect state judges. That's part of the old-fashionedness of the American system. And those are real. And the election of state prosecutors and state judges has been often the grounds for scandal in American life. But most of the federal civil service are professionals who serve on good behavior. That is, you have to show they've done something wrong before firing them. Something else that needs to be said, and I think that Elon Musk and his group who are trying to reform the government don't know this. The federal government employs about as many people today as it did during the John F. Kennedy administration. It is not a big employer of labor. And the civilian service in particular has not grown. And the reason for that, in 1962, the federal government delivered a lot of mail and processed a lot of Social Security checks. Now think about how many human beings it took to process a Social Security check in the days of typewriters and paper files, and how many it takes to do it today. So because the U.S. federal government is such an enormous consumer of information technology, that the things where the money is really spent, especially the civilian, like post office, Social Security Administration, they just need a lot fewer bodies than they did before the advent of computer technology. So the government has been actually under tremendous deflationary pressure. And now it's added a lot of functions since John F. Kennedy. But the idea that it's this big bloat, some state governments are, but the federal government is really not. And if you start trying to fire people, what you're going to discover is many of those people have good options. You start firing the staff of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Authority. Those people have options. Most people in the Department of Justice could walk out the door and work at better paid jobs tomorrow. They wouldn't have maybe as much satisfaction. They would have probably less maternity and paternity leave than they do as the government. The government has some attractions, but they have options. You start messing with this, you could have chaos. And I think this is a point I really want to drive home. I think a lot of people have an implicit model that Trump 2 will look like Trump 1, in that Trump 1 inherited about as favorable a set of conditions as any president has ever inherited. An economic expansion had begun in 2010. Trump inherited the back half of that economic expansion. He inherited a world that where major wars were winding down. He inherited a more or less peaceful planet. He inherited a period where interest rates were low and stable. None of those things are going to be true in Trump 2. I mean, it's already clear. We can already see trouble in the bond market, that interest rates are going to be higher. There are major battles going on all over the planet, and Trump intends to take the Russian side in Ukraine. He intends to empower Israel in the Middle East. And he's got a lot of very strange ideas about intervening directly in Mexico militarily against the cartels, which is probably the single biggest military threat in the immediate future that gets dangerously little discussion in the United States. And we are at the end of a long economic expansion, and he could find himself in much more turbulent waters than the easy ride he got in his first term.
Fascinating. I want to get to that international stuff in just a moment, but just to tease out the government efficiency and sort of cronyism and politicization of the civil service, to put a button in that, it strikes me that sometimes what I think Americans are talking about when they talk about government bloat is not actually bloat, but is underfunding and maybe unions that are too strong. Like the experience of going to the Department of Motor Vehicles in the United States to get your license, or the experience of mailing a letter at a post office, or even the experience of dealing with the Transportation Safety Administration when you're boarding a plane, is a lot more frustrating than it is in comparable countries. Al Franken used to have a line that, no offense against Republicans, David, but he used to have a line that Republicans run on the platform that government doesn't work, and then they get elected and prove it.
Yeah.
And to some extent, I think, there is a kernel of truth in that.
Well, first, most Americans don't carry around, and why should they, the difference in the functions of the federal, state, and local governments. And so among the Department of Motor Vehicles, of course, is a state and often a local responsibility. And many of the things that are most federally frustrating are indeed driven by, well, one of the complaints Americans will have is how difficult it is to get anybody on the phone if you have a question for the Internal Revenue Service. Well, that's an easy problem to fix. Hire more people, use more, and buy a lot more information technology, actually, because a lot of the questions can be answered by, a chatbot. But because the Republicans are above all answerable to people who own small family businesses, who are often have the best ways of hiding income of anybody in the society, that their group of people regard they will make it seem like having an effective IRS is the Gestapo. Now, if you're a W-2 earner with a little bit of freelance income, you want an effective IRS. You are declaring everything you make. You're not cheating, but you have a question, or you're wondering where your tax refund is. You want to talk to somebody, and because the government is answering to the car dealers who are cheating, that you don't have the people to help you. And so you get this impression.
And you don't have the investment in IT for it to work. I mean, dealing with the IRS is extraordinary. I tried to log on when I was doing my US taxes last year, and having been in Australia for a while now, I don't have to, but because I'm married to an American, there's all the kind of filing requirements. And I'd forgotten my password. So it said reset password. So I clicked that and I go through and I have to enter a number that was at the top of my last tax return. So I have to locate my last tax return and enter that. And then it says, congratulations, you've successfully requested a new password. It will arrive by mail in like 6 to 8 weeks. I was like, in Australia, I go onto an app and it sends a 2-factor authentication and wham, bam, we're done. We're in.
One of the things that the United States could do that most developed countries don't have tax returns. If you live in any European country, what you do is when it's tax time, you go to the website. The government has prepared a draft tax return for you. You can amend it if you want to. You forgot I have 3 children, not 2. I get more of a deduction than you think. But you click a couple of buttons, it takes seconds, and you process your return and your refund is in the mail. Now, Americans have been pressing for this idea in the United States for decades, and it has been opposed by our paid tax preparing services, it's H&R Block and companies like that. And the Republicans have been, both for ideological reasons and interest group reasons, have fought this. And in fact, during the last government shutdown, one of the demands was they were going to shut down the government and even default on the debt unless Biden stripped out the funding for the experiment for the self-populating income tax return that was one of the more positive agenda items of the Biden administration. So, as you say,
just clarify for me, David, articulate for me, why do they think ideologically it's a good thing for it to be really annoying to deal with the tax office?
Ideologically, because if you have a terrible time dealing with the tax office and you are an ordinary worker, you will then feel more sympathetic to the heart and soul of the Republican Party are people who own small family businesses that are not always as forthright with their taxes as they should be, and who regard the IRS as their enemy because it's always discovering, those tickets for the Super Bowl that you deducted as a business expense weren't a real business expense. There's income there was income in the company that should have been declared that you did not declare. You have a lot that the people have a lot of ability to hide and create false deductions. That's the spine of the Republican Party, and they hate the IRS and dread it, and they are trying to recruit allies among other people who have no reason to feel the same way. And making the IRS a miserable experience is a way that the spine of the Republican Party can recruit allies. Plus, H&R Block and other tax preparers spend a lot of money, almost all of it on Republicans, to defeat self-populating tax returns.
Okay, got it. All right, let's talk about the international order. The last episode that was released on this podcast was with Bhatia, who was the Republican pro-Trump voice, and she framed the things that she would like to see Donald Trump honor as the core of his platform in 3 ways. One was to restore social centrism, meaning anti-wokeness. The second was to be a hawk on terrorism, but not on foreign adventures, meaning an anti-militarism and maybe pro-Russia position. And the third was to defend American workers through tariffs and immigration reform. You mentioned international stuff. Let's start on, I guess, number 2. You're still associated in the Republican mind and in the American mind with a connection to a big foreign policy blunder, which is the Iraq War, and sort of is the bête noire of big military adventures of the past generation. How do you look at is it a phony binary between that kind of adventurism and isolationism, or where do you lie now?
Donald Trump and his vice president have talked often about firing rockets into Mexico to attack drug labs. Republicans in Congress have introduced resolutions calling for the United States to deploy military force inside Mexico against cartels. The first Trump administration thought very seriously, and the second Trump administration is taking a look at designating the cartels as international terrorist organizations against which the president would be authorized to use force. I don't know that we're going to get a war inside Mexico from Trump. But the danger signals are flashing. So if you tell me that your top issue is anti-militarism and you support Trump, I think, look, maybe you don't read news from Mexico. A lot of Americans don't. But we are heading toward a real risk of a very big military adventure with this administration, and one that will end disastrously because projects in Mexico can only work in cooperation with the Mexican government, and it will never cooperate with the United States firing rockets into meth labs in Mexico. Not that they don't deserve to be rocketed, but if they have to, you have to do it in conjunction with the government of the territory. Donald Trump's position on Ukraine is not anti-militarist. He and the people around him, are tremendously sympathetic to Russian militarism. Just in the days before the inauguration, they were speaking of annexing Greenland and the Panama Canal, both of which would be military adventures. And while they wouldn't be violent military adventures, Greenland belongs to Denmark, which is an EU country and a NATO member, and seizing territory from Denmark. I mean, obviously Denmark can't fight a war against the United States and wouldn't try, but it would rupture NATO and rupture the European Union and rupture US-EU relationships. So they're this administration, you have to deal with Trump as he is and not the fantasy version that some highly ideological people construct in their head. The idea that Donald Trump would have a care for workers. I know some people say that, and not all of them are idiots, but it's not true. And there's no reason to believe it is true. He has never cared for a working person in his life. There might be two sort of parallel metrics by which you could judge whether he cares about working people. You know, you might sort of do the dodge that some Christian conservatives did when they held their nose and voted for a guy who obviously behaved in ways that they thought were completely immoral, which is to say he may not give a shit about workers and he may be a little bit, misogynistic and handsy and uncouth, but his policies would be more pro-worker policies because he would raise tariffs and like the manufacturing base would come back. And then I say, you know what? Again, a lot of people admire tariffs, and they're not all idiots, but it really helps. Because how much do you have to not understand about tariffs and trade to imagine that the typical person would be better off? I mean, nothing. You can't understand nothing about it. So what a tariff is a tax on an imported good. Some of those goods are consumer goods, fruits and vegetables, clothing. But most of them will be inputs into other industrial processes. So when you start applying tariffs, what you're doing is raising the cost of every good and service produced in the United States. So you put a tariff on Mexican glass, that gets fabricated into an American window. The window is more expensive because of the tariff on Mexican glass. Because the window is more expensive, the condo building is more expensive. Because the condo building is more expensive, the condo is more expensive. Every tariff is also simultaneously and of necessity, and anyone who's ever looked at the subject understands this, a tax on exports. As your imports become more expensive, your exports become less valuable. And that means that the people inside the U.S. currency area are all poorer.
Explain why your exports become less valuable.
Well, it's sort of an accounting identity, but what you're doing is as you are making it more difficult for foreigners to sell goods into the United States, you're reducing the ability of foreigners to buy goods from the United States. And in fact, in exactly and literally a 1-to-1 ratio.
Is that because of retaliatory tariffs that the other country imposes, or in the absence of that?
It's an accounting thing. So the Mexicans sell the glass to the United States. They get $1.
I see what you're saying. Then your stuff is more expensive to. Yeah,
they use the dollar. They have fewer dollars.
Apart from the fact that you were going to start a trade war, and so it was very hard to de-escalate tariffs in the 80s because everyone had to hold their noses and jump and sort of do it at the same time because no one wants to be the idiot who doesn't have tariffs when everybody else does. But we managed to do it, and so it seems foolhardy now to. Of course, other people are going to put on tariffs if you've got.
In the 1980s, there are people still alive who remember the last time somebody had tried to do Trump-style economics and how it turned the economic crisis of 1929, 30, 31 into the Great Depression of 1932, 33 and toppled democracy in Germany and started World War II. And, you're talking to me. I'm sitting here in a house in Washington, D.C. This house was owned by, in a previous life, by a man who was a very distinguished officer of the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and who after that went on to be the chief writer for Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State for Franklin Roosevelt and was the leading free trader in the Roosevelt administration, helped to begin the process toward a post-war world of trading and freedom. And the man who lived in this house ghost wrote Cordell Hull's memoirs. Those Americans understood what tariffs had done, and not just to the prosperity of the world, but to the peace of the world. And they knew from dead friends, from disrupted lives, that if you want peace, you must have trade. And if you want trade, and growing trade, and if you want accelerating peace and stability and security, you must have growing trade. So, and the losers from trade protectionism are always the ordinary people. And the Americans who experienced tariffs from the Civil War to the Great Depression knew that firsthand. And so the idea that Trump is doing Trump, it may be, as I say, being an idiot here helps. And it may be that Trump just really doesn't understand. And he's driven by xenophobia. But there is no less pro-worker policy than tariffs. So
let me give voice to, I think, the Trumpist view, which is there has been a hollowing out of the middle class. There's been an upward funneling of cash from hard done by people to the top end of town for decades. And there's this unholy alliance between a Davos class and K Street and Washington, D.C. and lobbyists and everything. And like the system is stitched up and Appalachia is hurting. And look at the opioid crisis, right? Look at manufacturing, look at mining, look at decent job. You used to be able to have a home with like a single worker and they would be able to be middle class. That dream has faded. So excuse me if we all have to pay a little bit more for our flat screen TVs, but the benefit that we get from having the condo be more expensive, having the glass be more expensive, is that we have a robust manufacturing base and people have jobs. And yes, everything they buy might be slightly more expensive, although they also think that could be partly offset by, the foreign companies and countries being more efficient and swallowing some of their profits in order to eat the tariff. But even if we pay more, it's sort of a collectivist, communitarian way of, upholding our manufacturing base.
So the story goes, and I hope it's true, that during the filming of the first Star Wars, George Lucas handed a page of script to Harrison Ford, who read it over and said, "George, you can type this shit, but an actor can't say it." So what you just said is a string of words, all of them English, that form a grammatically correct sentence. But at no point do any of those words have any connection to any actual thought. Like how does any of this work? So what we do is we say, okay, so we take the Mexican glass that is going to go into the window and we put a tariff on it. And that does two things. It allows the American glass manufacturer to raise his price. And it means that it means that the consumers of the Mexican glass must buy less of it and must pay more for it. So we now have more expensive glass. Now we have more expensive windows and everything else that glass goes into. Millions.
Right, but hang on, let me just pause there. We have more expensive glass, which means that the glass company in Minnesota, which was about to go out of business, now may not go out of business because they can charge more for their glass.
The fundamental core mistake that when advocates of tariffs try to get fancy is they forget that every product is an input into somebody else's product. So, so the sheet, okay, you can say, okay, well, you just pay, here's your sheet of glass. It pays a little bit more. You have this beautiful American-made sheet of glass, and it's a little bit more expensive. But what they don't understand is what we have is a whole economy, every piece of which is less dynamic, less competitive, more expensive than its Chinese counterpart. Because everything you're tariffing is an input into another product. So when you raise the tariff on glass and on steel and on aluminum, and on everything else, you don't just make those things more expensive. You make everything more expensive. You'll end up having to do, and we did this in the 19th. It's not like this is like doing it on blackwood. We did this in the 19th century. You put a tariff on wool. Now you need to put a tariff on the coats because the coats are more expensive. Now you discover that you have to have all kinds of other kinds of discriminatory practices because the workers need to earn more to pay for the coats made out of the more expensive wool. And so it goes. So each tariff demands ever greater pressure for more tariffs because every product is an input into another product until eventually the whole economy is no longer competitive with the rest of the world. And that is the story of Argentina. So there's so many people who say, I love Trump and I love Milei. Well, Milei is at the end of a once industrial country, Argentina, that spent 50 years doing exactly what you recommend to Trump, which is saying, Argentina will make its own glass and therefore its own windows and therefore its own cars because everything will be out of competitive. And pretty soon you are completely priced out of world markets and can't compete with anybody, with anything. And this is not theory. It's been tried and tested. This is the story of the world. This is the story of America. Now, one of the things that the Trump people will say is, I've heard Trump say this, and his brains truster Robert Lighthizer, who wrote a big book, will say, well, we had very high tariffs in the 1890s, and we got more industrial then. So if we had very high tariffs in the 2020s, obviously, despite the lapse of 130 years of history, everything would be exactly the same. But, people have looked at this question, and it is true that the United States had high tariffs in the 1890s, and also it is true that it became more industrial. But those are not cause and effect. And the reason the two things that they forget is in the 1890s, unlike today, the United States was, despite its tariffs on the rest of the world, the largest free trade zone on the planet. That is, you had the most consumers subject to the same tariff in the United States. So it was a bigger economic zone than anybody else had, point one. Point two is tariffs mattered less because transportation costs were so high. So even if you had free trade in glass, the United States would be still making much of its own glass because glass was heavy and bulky. And it was difficult and after you paid the transportation cost, even in a free trade world, you wouldn't import that much. Then the United States was, for many other reasons, tremendously expanding both its population by immigration and its discovery of natural resources through exploration. And so it was enjoying what economists call extensive growth. That is adding more, not squeezing more value out of each factor of production, but adding more and more factors of production to produce more wealth. So, if you have 100 workers and they all do more, that's one way to get rich. Another is to take the 100 workers, add 10 more and have nobody produce more, but the 110 produce more than the 100. And that's very much what was happening in the United States in the 1890s, is you would add 10 more workers every year to your 100, 110, 120. And even though productivity was growing less rapidly than it would grow in a free trade world, because of the extensive growth, you offset it, especially because you're discovering new sources of iron ore and you're discovering new sources of petroleum. You're adding all of these more resources, more workers. It doesn't matter that it's not as efficient as it might theoretically be. But none of this is to say that you should try all of this again and rerun the 1890s in the 2020s and see if it works this time.
What if you were to target the tariffs, and I'm not even sure that this is something that Trump has floated, but instead of putting tariffs on input materials like steel and wool and so on, you say, here are 3 specific industries that have been decimated by globalization that we want to give a lifeline to. Let's say it's the car industry. There are instances of countries, South Korea, for example, which is now one of the best car producers in the world, didn't start its car industry in an environment of free trade. They protected that industry. They were like, we're going to do what Japan did, and we're going to become better at making cars than even the Americans and Europeans are. And they did that by closing off their car industry and forcing South Koreans to buy only South Korean cars for a while. Why is that wrong?
It's wrong for a number of different reasons. First, 3 industries and only 3. Henry George, who's a great writer on trade of the 19th century, had this very cynical but true observation that to introduce a tariff bill into a Congress or Parliament is like throwing a banana into a cage of monkeys. Soon, every one of them is screeching and yelling and demanding his own. You can't introduce a tariff bill into Congress and say 3 and only 3. Everybody else, you have to compete with the world. But our 3 favorite pets, by the way, all of whom gave lavishly.
But we do that. What about the CHIPS Act or any other form of, subsidy or subsidizing green energy or something like that? The government does
exactly.
All the time. Picks
yes,
winners
and you get metastasizing to the CHIPS Act and the green. These are not success stories. Then what happens is you at the same time. So first, everybody wants it. Second, you run into the problem that even a car is still an input into another product. American cars are made more expensive. what happens to rideshare services and the innovation that produced the rideshare economy? That cars are inputs too. Everything is an input into another product or another service. And then the last point is that the cost to consumer welfare remains real. Yes, South Korea did all the things you said, and it did industrialize. But the reason there's so much migration of South Korean talent from South Korea into the United States, and so little migration from the United States into South Korea, is that people with some education who didn't own the companies that got the benefit of the tariffs discovered, I'm a pretty good scientist, and I can live better, higher salary, more spacious apartment in the United States. And not because South Korea is so very crowded, because it's not that crowded, but because the presence of this protectionist system artificially depresses consumer welfare for every consumer.
I mean, maybe, but South Korea is 1/7 the size of the United States by population. So there are lots of reasons why people come to the United States. I moved to the United States, and it's not because Australia had tariffs.
But these effects, consumer welfare is lower. Tariffs always lower. They make your purchasing power less. They make the goods more expensive, and they make your wages buy less. And look, there are people who are so ideologically committed to it. Okay. But don't tell me that I have a policy of throwing open all the windows to my house and running the furnace maximally hot. And I'm doing this because of my commitment to environmental protection. That if you're putting on tariffs, you are not making workers better off. They're all going to be poorer. Their wages will count for less. They'll be able to buy less. Yes, they may work harder. But yes, they may do kinds of jobs that would otherwise be eliminated by competition or automation. But generally, we regard it as progress when people earn higher living standards by working less, not by earning lower living standards by earning more.
Right, but they're just not always the same person, right? I mean, the person who's put out of the coal mining job or the factory job isn't necessarily the same person who ends up getting the higher paid job in some industry that America is excelling in thanks to free trade.
But then we need to say, and this is, again, the problem with this kind of semi-intellectual movement that is intellectual Trumpism. Trumpism starts with the answers and works backward from there. So they've decided the answer is tariffs, and then they look for explanations and excuses. So it is true that one of the social problems we have in the United States is that at a given age, Americans are older than they used to be, but at a given age, an American is less likely to move from one state to another in pursuit of a job than even in the 1980s. About half as likely. Why? I could speculate. I don't know. And the people who study it more closely than they don't know either. So that's a reason why when there's an import shock that comes to a town and closes an industry, whereas once upon a time those people would have gotten in their Dodges and driven to another town in pursuit of jobs, they don't seem to do that anymore. It's a good question. Why not? Again, I don't have a ready answer. But that's your problem. If you are serious, that's your problem. But if you start with the answer, which is Trump has thus spake Trump, he said tariffs, therefore I say tariffs, therefore I am looking to backform a whole case for tariffs, and I will use any argument that comes to hand, and I don't worry too much about does it make sense or does it come true. And that's how one of the things that has happened on the center right is Trump is such an enormous corrupter of intellectual life on the center right, because it used to be, when I was a lad, the kind of person who was attracted to conservative intellectual life was someone who said, I'm kind of a less polite person than some others. I'm very interested in what is true. I'm a little less interested in hurting other people's feelings. And maybe I'd be a better person if it were the other way around. Maybe it's more admirable to be the person who soft pedals. But I'm really interested in what is true. And I don't care where the chips fall. And I'm describing myself a little bit. And again, I don't look back on this entirely with pride. It's not always an amiable or attractive.
I'm still in the prideful phase of that mindset, David. So okay. I await my own remorse for it.
Okay. But maybe, but what has happened now, and you see this at all the Washington think tanks, is actually the rewards of the people who are attracted to this are the people who want glib formulas and who are worried about what their peers think and are scared to say the wrong thing and know that there are certain positions you're supposed to take, and around them are the here be dragons territory where you can't, if you can't read too smart a book. You can't think too hard. You can't learn because you realize that much of what we're saying is not true. And especially the tariffs. And the tariffs question, this is not a close question. This is not we're not here at the outer edge of advanced physics theory. We are dealing with like the most basic proposition in economics. I mean, everyone who studied this says we're full of shit.
You're giving me like a constriction in my chest just because it feels like it's such an example of a whole way of thinking about almost everything that infuses so much in the way that we're talking to each other, not just in Trumpistan, but in culture more broadly, that we've got our sides, we've picked our lane, we don't want to hear what we don't want to hear, whether it's tariffs or whether it's vaccines or whatever.
It's you know what? You don't have to, when you say we do that, what are they going to do? Arrest you? It's still a free country. I mean, I remember, look, one of Elon Musk's...
No, I'm not saying that I can't say it. I'm just saying that there is... that many people find themselves unwittingly inside an echo chamber where...
That's a choice. Back before Elon Musk saved America by destroying Twitter, people would get upset because they would say something and they would then make the mistake of taking something that needed to be said in longer form and compressing it into a few words and putting it on Twitter. And then all kinds of people would yell at them and they would morally collapse. And I've been through a few of those Twitter storms before Elon Musk destroyed Twitter. And I held people's hands for it. What is happening here? It's just, you're sitting in your comfortable library with a hot fire on a winter day and there's howling winds outside and you feel them because the window's open. You know what you should do? Close the window and it all goes away. All they're doing is yelling on the social media platform and no one will remember it even 11 seconds later. Just don't be so scared.
I mean, that's true today, but it wasn't true then because people got fired after social media pile-ons.
You know what?
People lost friends.
I've been fired. I've lost friends. It's not fun. But you know what's worse? Being a worm.
Yeah, it's true. I want to get to international politics and to NATO and global stability and everything. But before we leave workers, the subject of workers, immigration is something we need to touch. So there's been this whole brouhaha for the past few months, which Batya and I went into some detail on the last episode about, skilled migration visas and the whole H-1B snafu between Elon and Tech on one side and Trumpistan and MAGA on the other. My understanding of Trump's appeal on immigration was that his core pledge was to stop illegal immigration, to build a wall, to deport people who are living in the United States illegally, especially violent ones. That's what I understood the core of his message to be. But when I listen to the anti-H-1B, make America great again, like isolationist, I suppose, don't want to call them xenophobic necessarily, but, anti-immigrationist wing of Trumpistan, they seem much more focused actually on reducing legal immigration, which I didn't understand to be a core part of the Trump pitch, but I feel like maybe his supporters view it as such. Where do you stand on this and what would the impact be?
Well, I agree with you. I think the reason this issue has become so important in so many developed countries is because it's so much cheaper to travel than it used to be. And because we have seen the growth of transnational criminal networks that for an investment of $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, maybe $30,000 will get a person with a little bit of property in Africa or Asia, transport them to a country where they can earn more and get back the investment and use the asylum system. So we're having this huge influx of tens of millions of people from the less developed world to the more developed world. And each and every one of those people is enterprising and ambitious and striving, and any one of them would probably be a benefit to the country that receives them. But as with any kind of human movement, something that is, you put one car on the freeway, it's a delight. You put 5, it works. You put 1 million and the highway stops moving. So you can't have 1 million cars on the highway. In the same way, you need some restraint on the number of people moving from country to country. And because so many of these people are brought here by transnational criminal enterprises, many of them are just paying the enterprises, but a disproportionate number of them turn out to be criminals themselves, including the people operating the transnational criminal enterprises are certainly criminals themselves. And they end up, they're people, the gang or the cartel has people on every stage of the journey, including the receiving stage in the United States or Australia or wherever it is. And those people are real criminals and often violent criminals, and they commit all kinds of crimes. So there's a real problem. And in the United States, Biden, because of an excessive desire to reverse every single thing that Trump did, and because, for complex ideological reasons with the Democratic Party, reverse some of the progress that had been made during the Trump years toward restraining these flows. We got a huge influx of millions of people. And it's been very disturbing, and Americans want it stopped reasonably. And they want the most dangerous people sent home reasonably. And they certainly want people who have literally a judicial order saying, you have exhausted every appeal, you must leave the country last Tuesday being in 2019. And that piece of paper, let's say that guy who was ordered to leave the country last Tuesday in 2019 and is still here in 2025, we want him gone too. So that's a real thing. And Trump could do himself a lot of good if he said, you know what, we've got some hundreds of thousands of people who have valid deportation orders against them, who should have been who left the country in 2019 or 2018 or 2014. They've exhausted every appeal. Out, I'm rounding them up. What's your argument against not deporting somebody whom a court of law has said should be deported? And also all the people with criminal records who've been sentenced, serve their time for their crime. The sentence is over. We don't release them on the street. We send them back. So that seems to me all reasonable and valid. But we are going through this kind of emotional crisis in America. And again, people haven't thought this through. What does, if you are doing both the tariffs, which make every good and service more expensive, and you're also shrinking your labor force at the same time, you take those two, take those two cars, smash them head to head against each other, what happens? Big bang, but not successful traffic. So Trump's
in some ways, I'm slightly heartened by your pessimism about his economic competence, because it means that within the next 12 months, the shit's going to hit the fan and he's going to be scrambling to figure out what to do about it. And he's not going to like. The shit's going to hit the fan in a way that he doesn't like, not in a way that he likes.
The bond market,
the economy to fall off a cliff.
Bond futures are already telling us that interest rates will be higher in the second half of 2025 than they are going to be than they are today. The mortgage market, which peaked in 2023 at about 8%, softened a little bit to about 7% in 2024. It looks like it's rising again.
Wait, what is that percentage that you're talking about?
The mortgage rate. If you want to borrow money,
the interest rate. I see.
To buy a home.
Right. The home loan. Right. Yeah. Got it.
So I said at the beginning, I think that Trump inherited, until he was hit with the first crisis of his presidency, the pandemic, which he completely bungled. Trump had very smooth sailing for his first 3 years. The basic story of the Trump administration is this. The first Trump. We have this terrible recession in 2008, 2009. We have a slow recovery from that recession. And as late as 2014, Americans are still not back where they need to be. But the Federal Reserve begins to get scared in 2014 that the economy is growing too fast, and they overcorrect and they tighten interest rates in 2014. And we get a slowdown of economic activity in 2015 and 2016. And that's what defeats Hillary Clinton and elects Donald Trump. Then the Federal Reserve realizes, you know what? We overcorrected. The economy, we have more room. And they opened the taps, and we got strong growth in 2017, 2018, and 2019, and a popular presidency and easy times for Trump and no real tough decisions to make. And a lot of the people assume, well, if he inherited that good luck the first time, he will inherit not only good luck, but the same good luck the second time. But it's not going to be the same. In 2019, he is going to be, in 2025, he's heading into a more restrictive environment. And his policies, trade tariffs, which I completely reject, and immigration control, which I support when it's rational and not racist and punitive, those are both going to be deflationary. He's got higher interest rates on his hands. It's going to be bumpy.
To give him credit the first time, he also injected stimulus into the economy through massive tax cuts. What if he just tries to offset the deleterious effects of tariffs and immigration reform by giving a massive tax cut to everybody, borrowing a ton of money from China?
Great question. Great question. That's tougher to do this time, because this time, remember, his tax cuts in 2017 are going to be expiring at the end of 2025. So he's going to need.
They won't, though, right? They'll be renewed.
Well, okay, but suppose they are renewed. That's not an additional tax cut. That's just keeping, like in 2017, it's a new tax cut.
I see. Yeah, so you'd have to get it through. But no Republican would oppose a gigantic tax cut, would they?
Well, there's a problem, which is the normal rule it's a stupid rule, but it's the rule, is that to take anything through the U.S. Senate takes 60 votes, not 50. Not 50
because
plus
of the
1, but 60.
filibuster.
The filibuster. There's an exception, which is if it's a fiscal measure, and if it does not increase the deficit over a 10-year period.
This is reconciliation, right?
And if it doesn't touch Social Security, then you can pass it with 50. He also has a 1-vote margin in the House of Representatives. So he has to, any measure has to pass. He's got a 1-vote margin in the House, and he has to make it revenue neutral. And he has to keep in place the tax cut that is expiring from 2017. So the idea that he's got room, a lot of room for additional stimulus beyond the stimulus the economy is already enjoying.
And David, who decides whether it's revenue neutral? Why can't he just jot on the back of a napkin, there's going to be, AI is going to give huge dividends and it's all going to be fine?
The Congressional Budget Office decides. You're right, he could do that. But that's its own uproar. And he's got a 1-vote margin in the House. And when all the, right now that may change as there's some empty seats. His margin may grow ultimately to be a 3-vote margin, but it's a very narrow House.
Right.
And as I say, we're not talking about, he needs not just the same stimulus that is there from 2017.
I see. Yes.
Lapses at the end of 2025, which he wants to renew. To get to offset the other things he wants to do, he will need additional stimulus, and he has to make that revenue neutral.
Elon and Vivek are going to have to do a really good job of finding some extra money to pay for these tax cuts.
Yeah. Or he has to overrule the Congressional Budget Office and say, you know what, I decree that it's revenue neutral, but that's another fight.
So just before we leave the subject of immigration, it does amaze me that there is not more support, and maybe you can shine some light on this, for a system in which there is more verification of employment in the United States to discourage the inward flow. Like when I got to the States and realized that my Social Security card was a piece of cardboard with some numbers stamped on it, and that and when my immigration attorney told me that I could do work and could pay tax on that and could report my income to the IRS without that being reported to immigration, that was extraordinary. I mean, if I
what year was that?
Get a job, that was in 2006.
Yes. Okay. That's a very crucial
Has
fact.
that changed?
Yes. So one of the reasons we have the kind of immigration crisis we have now is that after about 2008, the United States did get much better at cracking down on exactly the kind of abuse that you were invited to commit.
Which I didn't, by the way. I ended up paying the immigration attorney thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to get me an O-1 visa instead.
Very good. Good for you. But and the result of that was we saw a great reduction in illegal immigration of the traditional type. So we used to have a crisis which was mostly young, mostly men, mostly from Mexico, walking across the border, trying to evade the authorities in order to work illegally off the books using a fake Social Security number, and taking money, sending money home to their families who remained in Mexico or maybe Central America. We have become more and more effective at cracking down on that kind of abuse. And so we have less and less of illegal immigration classic. And we have a new kind of problem, which is asylum abuse. The people who cross the border now come as families, and they don't try to elude contact with the authorities. They turn themselves in.
I see.
They say, here I am. I'm seeking asylum. And that means I am not illegal. I have signed up for, and this happens in Australia too. Now I get a number in the queue, and I'm looking forward to my asylum hearing sometime in the 2040s. And pending.
So in fact, a wall would not even fix that, because they would just come to the gate and they'd say, I'm declaring asylum.
Yeah. Well, the wall would help, because what you can do is say, you know what? The gate is locked. And although our law requires us to let you into the gate, in fact, we have a deal with the Mexicans where you get questioned on the Mexican side of the border and then you stay in Mexico. This is how Trump dealt. There was an immigration crisis in the early part of the Trump presidency, and he developed this remain in Mexico policy that said your hearing, until you get your hearing, you stay in Mexico. You can't work in the, and
I mean, this is basically what Australia does. You're not going to set foot on Australian soil coming here by boat. Like, you're going to be processed offshore.
No, that's the correct answer. And Biden reversed that and destroyed his presidency, and it was a foolish thing of him to do. And Trump could go back to remain in Mexico, but remain in Mexico requires cooperation with Mexico. And remember, Trump's policy is tariffs on Mexico and shooting rockets into Mexican territory.
Right. All right, let's talk about that, and Greenland and NATO and everything. I mean, the biggest thing that I'm afraid of over the next, not just Trump presidency, but quarter century, or I suppose this century, is that the painstakingly put together coalition of peace that we established after World War II is going to break down, and that we will return to the civilizational human norm of countries randomly invading each other. And even if you're not one of the countries that gets invaded, that means you're going to have to spend tremendous amounts of wealth and energy and ingenuity on your military and on figuring out ways not to get invaded and on making complicated bilateral or multilateral arrangements instead of just relying on the linchpin of American power plus NATO plus mutually assured destruction, or whatever, however else you want to conceive of it, the UN Security Council. How much damage can he do?
A lot has been done already. And that's this Greenland business. I mean, it seems farcical. And there is, of course, a core of a real problem there, which is, Greenland does control the access from northern Russian waters into the North Atlantic. So since World War II, there have been American naval bases and British naval presence as well. The Royal Navy used to police the area, waters around Greenland in a way that it doesn't do anymore. There are some real problems there. And there is this, NATO got smug and lazy and complacent and underinvested, and the waters around Greenland are one of the places where you see the consequences of the NATO underinvestment. But as you say,
in what way do you see them?
Because the British have so many fewer ships than they did in the 1990s.
But who cares?
Well, what happens if you're worried that a hostile power, Russia or China, may try to sidle warships past Greenland into the North Atlantic from the Russia's northern waters, Murmansk and places like that. You want the British Navy there patrolling it, or else the American Navy.
To do what? There are thousands and thousands and thousands of miles of frigid Canadian coastline that they have to pass by before they get to the United States.
Just to know where they are. Because what you want to know is if there's a conflict, that we have identified where every Russian or Chinese warship is, and it can be neutralized in the first minutes of the conflict.
I see. Right.
Yeah, you can't do anything to them in peacetime. These are international waters. Of course, they can flow, but it's important to know where they are so that if they're on their way to do something bad, they can be neutralized quickly.
Okay.
So there's a problem here, but the answer to every problem, as you so eloquently said just now, since 1945, since 1941, has been collective action. And we've had this tremendous success of the two most dangerous enemies the democratic world ever faced, Japan and Germany, have now been recruited into two of the most potent allies the democratic world has. And we're all stronger for their cooperation. We wish they would do more. But they do something, and it's better to have them with us than against us. And so that core alliance of the English-speaking countries has been reinforced and fortified, and lots of small democracies like Denmark play their part. And this is a tremendous achievement, led by the United States, but not by Americans only. Australians and Canadians played an important part in building all of these institutions. And Trump really does not respect them, fears them, and is instinctively hostile to democratic allies.
What do you think's going on there?
At bottom, if you're a normal democratic politician, prime minister or president, you wander into the poorest town in your country and go to the meanest street and meet the person with the worst job, and that person is your boss. He votes for you, you work for him. And however high and mighty you are when you're on with the great seal of the United States, you are in the end a public employee, and you work. The lowest person in your country is your boss. And I think Donald Trump hates that thought, hates it with every fiber of his being. What he admires are the reason that with Putin and with Xi and with the dictators of other countries, Venezuela, which he seems to have a strange admiration for, they are the masters. There's no question that the people obey them. The people owe them gratitude. Remember how Trump would always talk about how people should be nicer to him and give him gratitude? Now, there's a story in Bill Clinton's memoirs. When Clinton was governor of Arkansas, the term was only 2 years, so he was up for re-election all the time. And he tells a story in his book about being at a county fair, and there's a local person we know who's always been a supporter, and he asks him, Jim Bob, can I count on your support in the next election? And Jim Bob says, well, I'm thinking about it, Governor, thinking about it real hard. And Clinton says, I've done this. I've done this. I've done this. And Jim Bob, in your town, on your street, in your high school, I did this, this, and this. What do you mean you're thinking about it? And Jim Bob replies, well, you got paid every 2 weeks, didn't you? Meaning, I don't owe you for the new high school. That's my money that paid for the high school. Thank you for doing it, I guess. But I don't owe you gratitude. You worked for me. And if you did a good job, I will think about reelecting you. But you worked for me. So Trump's thing doesn't accept that. And he thinks it would be much better to be someone like Putin, who doesn't have to be nice to Jim Bob. He would say to Jim Bob, I gave you this money. You owe me thanks.
I think isn't there a scene in, might be Mad Men, where one of the female characters says to her boss, I just wish I had more respect around here. And he says, that's why we pay you money.
Right.
What do you want? I completely agree. Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I mean, when you think about, when you were talking about the person in the poorest town, it made me think of the contrast between Trump and Carter.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter continued doing Sunday school lessons. He was in his 90s giving Sunday school lessons for free to, young people. Imagine Trump giving, doing charitable service each week to talk to the spiritual values of, a younger generation. It's
yes.
It's an Onion headline at that point, Trump trying to teach young people about what's really important, pussy and money.
Yeah.
All right. Final thoughts, I guess. What's best case, worst case? Actually, before we get to best case, worst case scenario, you were talking about at the beginning about this weird tingling that people get when Trump touches their mean side, when he gives them permission to love things that they would otherwise regard as being beneath them, that he speaks to our worst interests. And I must say, I felt like I feel a bit of that. I feel like this inauguration, there's 95% me with my face in my palm going, I can't believe this maniac is coming back into power. And 5% of me is like, I mean, what if your only metric was what makes America great? And if you had to threaten to invade Denmark to get Greenland, you just fucking did it. What if you were so unhinged that you just said fuck it all to every single norm and you were like, we are the greatest country in the world and everyone can go fuck themselves for the next 4 years. We're going to do whatever the fuck we want.
Yeah.
Like do you feel any of the frisson, or am I just 5% evil?
No, you. I feel it in the sense that I'm aware of it. I think I'm probably a somewhat more religious person than you are. And
as an atheist, that would be a fair statement. Yeah.
Okay. I remember when Trump gave, just before the COVID pandemic, he gave a 4th of July speech on the Mall in Washington. When the speech was all about the military greatness of the United States. And we conquered this and we did that and we settled the West. And there was nothing about the Constitution. There's nothing but democracy. There's nothing but the ideals. I found myself remembering there's a poem by Rudyard Kipling called Recessional, where he talks, this is where the phase that's gotten Kipling into a lot of trouble, heathen breeds without the law. And people hear that quote and think he's talking about poor people or Africans. He's talking about the Germans. Because he said, heathen breed without the law, people who boast and brag and who put their trust in cannon and gun and not in the word of God. And that is that boastful. I have to say, I have this, that when you are talking like that, you're not, that greatness, you're Ozymandias. You're just a blowhard. Because the real greatness of America has been when it has aligned its enormous power for good. And that power has often been used for ill. And through the first 70 years of this country, American military power was often used to recapture slaves or to protect slaving ships on the high seas. American power has often been used for ill, and other times in history too. But the justification for that power, yes, it's exciting that you can do anything. But there's this moral impulse that says the justification for power is how it's used, and is it used in service? And that boastfulness and it's blasphemous. It strikes me as blasphemous. And so I hear it. I hear something Luciferian in that way of talking, and that boast precedes the fall.
Yep. It's also so short-sighted because it assumes that you're going to be the one with the power forever.
It also assumes you don't need friends. Why is in international relations theory, they'll conjure up the story of the Western world has been of one great power rising to dominance after the other. The Habsburgs, Louis XIV, the Kaiser's Germany. And each of them is eventually brought down because they so frighten everybody else. They conjure against them coalitions of neighbors, each of them smaller than the great power, but cumulatively greater than the great power. And together, the coalition against the great power destroys the great power.
Right.
Well, the United States has been the strongest power in the world since probably 1918. And it's never encountered that because it's given everybody a better deal, which is actually, you want to work with us because we actually will not constantly be asserting our most narrow and immediate selfish interests. We define our interests as what's good for you is also good for us. And when you feel secure, we feel more secure. And so there's never been that anti-American coalition that was formed against the Habsburgs, against Louis XIV, against the Kaiser's Germany, because the conscious, you know what? Cheap military protection and access to a collectively protected global common market, that's a sweet deal.
Yeah.
It's a sweet deal. Okay. We're not going to combine against you. We're going to combine with you. And that is an exception to everything that international relations theory would tell you should happen. So it's not just being a nice person. It's also defeating the logic of great power politics because the United States has just found you are more secure with friends and allies, especially with highly capable friends and allies, than you are as a lone dominating empire.
That's really interesting. I had never really thought about the fact that, the European Union has more people than the United States and it has more money than the United States. It may not have quite as many bombs as the United States, but it wouldn't take very long to make them. And if if the rest of NATO sans USA plus Australia and Japan and a coalition of other countries were in a war with the United States, you couldn't guarantee that the US would win it. And that's without looking at Russia or China or any other great power that we might align ourselves with. And but when we're all on the same side, it's a force maximizer.
Yeah. And meanwhile, the alternative power sources, China's the leading one. China's surrounded by enemies. Go around the clock. Korea, Japan, Vietnam, the Philippines, India, and potentially even Russia, although right now they're in alignment. That China cannot fight a war against any of its neighbors without worrying that the other neighbors will take advantage of that to harm China in some way. Whereas the United States is surrounded by water and friends, or used to be, and reinforced by friends. And those networks of friendship, they are powerful, powerful resources. And the way you get the networks of friendship is by doing unto others as you would have others do unto you.
What's the worst case scenario and the best case scenario for the next 4 years? There are worst case, best black swan scenarios of really unlikely events. But if we're doing sort of a conservative case, the worst case scenario is interest rates rise in the second half of 25, keep rising in 2026. Trump does the tariffs, does a very thoughtless immigration crackdown. We plunge into a recession in 2026 that's hard to get out of. A darker case, worst case scenario is he gets us into a shooting war in Mexico because he starts firing missiles into Mexico and the cartels start retaliating in American cities. And we're now into a kind of continental counterinsurgency that we don't have any way to win or solve. And when you say the cartels counter, presumably they don't have the equipment to be able to do so from Mexico. Are you talking about civil actions in American cities? The cartels are present in the United States, and they have green cards, and so it wouldn't be much hard. These criminal cartels try to do their best to avoid contact with American power. The last thing they want is to get the United States involved in Mexico, and they go out of their way to avoid. And anytime the United States gets mad at them, they back off. There was an incident a couple of years ago where 4 Americans were
were seized by the cartels on the Mexican side of the border. I forget which border town. The cartels thought they were Haitians, because they were Black Americans. They thought they were Haitians who had come in to do some freelance narco trafficking. They murdered 2 of them, tortured the 2 others, and only after the 2 people were killed did they realize these were American passport holders. At which point they released the surviving 2, and the 6 people who supposedly did the kidnapping turned themselves into the Mexican authorities and said, "We did this. We will accept whatever punishment." Of course, there was no punishment. But an elaborate demonstration: we do not want to tangle with the United States. But if the United States insists on tangling with them, they have a lot of ways of striking back.
Like what?
Like letting off carn bombs in San Antonio and San Diego, and like doing inside the United States what they now do inside Mexico, shooting judges.
Okay, is that the end of your worst case scenario? Because that's pretty fucking
No,
bleak.
I can go into even worse case. NATO collapses. The Russians take over Ukraine. Israel is emboldened into an all-out war with Iran that turns into a major missile exchange in the Middle East. A lot of bad things can happen, but the things I'm most worried about, I'd say, are a real crisis in the American economy caused by tariffs and immigration restriction at the same time as we're having interest rates rising for reasons independent of all of those, and real conflict inside Mexico.
Best case scenario, okay? We're talking in 4 years' time. There's been a Democrat elected, and we're like, you know what? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
The best case scenario is that the shock of losing to Trump in 2024 chastens the Democrats and makes them say, you know what? Criminals really do belong in prison. Drugs really are bad. Borders do have to be protected. You know what? And if somebody makes an unfortunate joke, you can just not laugh.
What happens to your party, though, David?
Well, I left the Republican Party after many, many years, after the reelection of Donald Trump, because I realized, you know what, it's not going to get better in my lifetime. That what I'd stuck around, as unhappy as I was, because, you know what, as you said, you mentioned the Iraq War. I mean, I was part of the things that went wrong, and it's my duty and my obligation and my honor to do whatever little bit I could to put the party back on the McCain-Romney path after Trump. But it's not going to happen in my active lifetime. I can see that. So there's no point sticking around. I'm certainly not a liberal or a Democrat. I remain what I always was, a free trader, a believer in collective security, a believer in the goodness and worth of the American experiment, a believer in that Western civilization is bigger and better than any of its detractors are willing to admit. Someone who thinks that we should look at the Enlightenment and liberalism without guilt or shame, even though we acknowledge that bad things were done because of and in the name of those ideas. And I don't worry too much about where is there a home. My head is enough home.
David Frum, happy Inauguration Day.
Thank you.
That was great.